I want to talk about a data fetching mistake that I see a lot of junior developers make in their React applications. This one might be a little bit controversial. I actually made a short video about this just a few days ago, and it got a few people talking. The mistake is not using React Query. I genuinely believe that no matter how small your React application is, or even what type of application it actually is, that you should always be using React Query, that you should default to React Query. And I find it unfortunate that React doesn't come with a default solution for data fetching and asynchronous state, because it leaves us with all of these different options that we have to choose from, and as a junior developer, it's hard to make the right choice. I'm here to tell you in this video that it's always React Query. Now, I know that's a bold statement, and maybe you don't agree with that statement, and that's totally fine. That's valid. I want to, in this video, give you my arguments as to why I believe that React Query is always the solution. We're going to look at different examples of React applications, from the most simplest ones to something that is a little bit more real, and even something that lives on the server, because now we have modern React, we're also running React on the server. Now, I just want to be clear, when I'm saying React Query, I don't only mean React Query, I also mean the similar libraries that you have, like SWR, Redux Toolkit Query, or anything similar, right? I'm really talking about using something like React Query versus not using it, and why it's always better to use something like React Query. So watch the video and let me know what you think. And if at the end of the video you still disagree with me, then leave me a comment down below. I would love to hear your use case and why you think not using React Query is a better solution. Now, before we get to the video, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. Brilliant is a learning platform that helps you become a better thinker and problem solver with thousands of visual interactive lessons covering topics like math, science, programming, data analysis, and AI. Brilliant has a learning platform that is designed to be uniquely effective. Each lesson that you have on there is filled with hands-on problem solving that actually lets you play with the concepts that you're learning, which is a method that has been proven to be 6 times more effective than watching traditional lecture videos. Their courses are designed to build your understanding from the ground up, and they mix engaging challenges with competitive features and daily reminders to help you stay consistent. Plus, all of the content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from places such as Stanford, MIT, Microsoft, Google, and more. And if you're into programming, they have a growing collection of programming courses that is a great way to build timeless problem-solving skills to really thrive in this ever-evolving world of programming. From learning Python to developing an intuition for computer logic, you're going to get hands-on experience with real programs, and you're going to learn to think like a real programmer. You can start learning for free by going to brilliant.org/cosmosolutions, scanning the QR code on the screen, or using the first link in the description. And for my viewers, Brilliant is offering 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything that Brilliant has to offer. Thank you once again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and now let's talk about React Query in React. Alright, so let's begin. So here I have a simple component, and our job here is to implement data fetching in this component. We have this API URL over here that we can fetch data from, and what we want to do is fetch the data, store it in this component, and then eventually show it. We're not going to be concerned in this example with actually showing it. We're only going to focus on the data fetching part. Now, this is running in a Next.js application, and this is running on the client, so we have the use client directive here at the top. But let's put that aside for a moment, because I really want you to think that this would be a simple standalone component in a client-only React application with no framework or nothing else that we can use. So how would you approach data fetching? Well, as I said in the introduction of the video, React doesn't come with a default. So you have to pick something from all of the different options that we have. Whether it's doing it directly in the component, whether it's using something like React Query or similar, or whether it's doing this on the server, which we could because we are working in Next.js. Now, we're going to go through each one of those in this video, but let's first start with the simplest one. Let's do it directly here in the component, which honestly, as a junior developer, it might be your first instinct to do. Because as a junior developer, you're learning React, right? This whole new world of React is right there for you to learn, and it's very difficult to immediately start thinking about other things that you want to implement and integrate directly into your application. Usually, as a junior developer, you're going to opt for the simplest and the most obvious solution, which is going to be to do it directly inside of the component here with a useEffect. So this is what that would look like, right? So first you come here and you create here a piece of state, you call it post, you import this from React. We have here the type of the post, which is ID and then the title. And then you might do something like this. You might do a useEffect over here, right? That is going to use the fetch API, passes it here the API URL, and then we're going to get the response.json, and then we're going to set the post once we have that, and we're going to get the actual post in our React state. Now, I just want to make some slight changes here. I want to do this in a slightly different way by just doing here function and then fetch posts. And then I'm going to call the function here because that's a little bit more representative as to what you would actually do. And I like to do it here by doing const response, doing the await approach and doing an asynchronous function. That's just my own personal preference. So here we have the same exact thing. We have a function to fetch the post. We're calling the fetch API, awaiting response.json, and then setting the post with our data from the API. Right, so there you go. We've just achieved data fetching in the simplest way possible, using a useEffect and calling a function onMount to actually get our data and set it in a state. This is fine, and this will work. We will actually show our data inside of our application. We're not actually showing it, but again, we're not worried about implementing that. Now, although this code is functionally correct, right, it will actually do our data fetching and it will store it in the post, which we can then use to actually show it in the UI. This has a couple problems. The first one is that this is a bad user experience because it's missing any sort of loading state. The way we currently have it here is that the posts get initialized with an empty array. So initially on the first render, we're not going to have any posts to show. Then we're going to fetch these posts here once the component mounts. That is going to take some time, a few hundred milliseconds, and only then are we going to be able to show the posts. But until that happens, the user who's using this application actually has nothing to see on the screen and has no way to know that effect is actually going on. Right? And this is such a simple thing, but it goes a long way. If you show some sort of loading indicator to your users, they know to expect something and they are going to wait the few hundred milliseconds while your data fetching is happening. With this code here, we don't have that. So that's a problem. That's a bad user experience. Now, of course, this is easy to fix, right? We can come here and we can do const and then isLoading, create a state for the loading. And then here in the fetch post function, we can set isLoading to true initially. Then we fetch our data, we get our data over here. Then we're going to set here isLoading to false. And then we're going to set our posts. And maybe we want to set our posts here, even though they're going to happen at the same time, just for a clear organization. Good. Now we've implemented loading and now we at least are showing something to the user while the fetch is going on. Now, we could also make the same argument for the error. That's also something that is missing here, because the way that we currently have it, we're not tracking any potential errors. We're not handling them, right? We're making this fetch request and something could go wrong in the fetch request. The backend server might be down, right? We never know. So we need to handle this error case as well. So how would we do that? Well, we can come here, we can create a new state variable. We can call this isError like this, and we can just keep it as a Boolean to keep things simple. And then we need to go inside of our fetch post function and actually handle the error case at every single point that we can have an error. And here in this case, there's actually 2 points that can throw an error. The first one is the response over here. This fetch call can throw an error for whatever reason. The backend might be down, so we need to handle that. But this here, this await response.json can also throw an error because maybe the response is not valid JSON, right? You can't always confirm 100%. So you also need to handle the error in this case. Now, the way that we can do that is we can wrap this in a try catch block. So we can put here a try catch block and let's see if cursor can actually do it for me. It can't, so let's let it help it for a second. Aha, there you go, right? So now we have a try catch block. Inside of the try block, we're going to try our response over here. So we're going to fetch it. Then we're going to await the response.json. So if either of these actually has an error, it's going to get caught over here by this error here. And then in this error, we're just going to change it like this to finally. If we have an error, we're just going to set isError to true. In this case, we actually don't need to do anything with the error specifically. And then finally, in any case, we're going to set isLoading to false. Now, this is great, right? Because now we have a fetch, we have loading, and we have error states. So we've actually implemented this functionality. But the thing is, by implementing this functionality here, we've actually increased our surface area for potential bugs. Because now, not only do we have to handle the fetch request, but we also have to handle the loading and error states and setting them correctly at the right place. We have to remember to set isLoading to true every single time before we start the fetch request. Then we have to remember to set isError to true in the catch block, and finally set isLoading to false. But maybe we make a mistake here. Maybe we forget to set isLoading to false, and then we can have ourselves a situation where both the error and the loading are true at the same time. This is what we call an impossible state. And then your user experience is going to be bad because the user is going to see that it's loading indefinitely when actually there's an error, right? So the surface area for bugs increased, and we now have more code to manage, which can increase bugs. And that is going to be true increasingly as we move forward and add more functionality here. Because even at this point, even with loading and error states, it's still not enough. There's still a lot of things missing here. For example, what happens if we have a const here, a page state variable here, which we're going to set to default of 0? What if we now have a page over here, and here we actually want to pass it as we're fetching, right? We want to fetch a paginated list of posts, right? Now, because we're using the page here in this useEffect, right, we of course have to pass it in the dependency array of the useEffect. So now we've introduced another state variable that we also now have to manage, and that can also introduce potential bugs, right? Because now our page here is passed in the dependency array of the useEffect. This means that every single time that our page changes, we're going to get a new fetch request with a new page, which is what we want. We set the page to 1, we want to fetch the page 1, right? So every single time that page changes, maybe we have here in the JSX a button that the user can press to change the page, we're going to trigger a fetch request. But now with this, we've actually introduced yet another potential bug. And this is a pretty big one. And this is a race condition, right? So now because the page changes, let's assume that we're on the first render, right? So page is going to be 0. We're going to trigger this fetch request over here. It is going to fetch the page 0, but let's say that for whatever reason, that request gets delayed. Maybe the server is down just momentarily and we have to wait a little bit longer for that first initial page. What happens if the page changes before that request actually returns? Let's say that the user is really fast and they want to go to the next page, so they click page 1 and then we're triggering a new fetch request. And let's say that the server is now back online, so the page 1 actually returns, but it returns before page 0. Eventually, when page 0 is going to return, right, we're going to get this code over here, we're going to get the data, and then we're going to set our post over here. But this is going to be effectively overwriting the results of page 1 because it came after. And this is what we call a race condition, right? Because now we're going to have page 1, but we're actually going to have the results of page 0 displayed on the screen. This is a horrible user experience, and your user is going to be very confused as to what's going on. So yet again, we've increased the surface area for potential bugs and things that we have to manage. Now, of course, there is a fix for that. We can fix and prevent race conditions, but again, that is going to introduce more code and more opportunities for things to go wrong. Now, the way that you would approach fixing this race condition, there's actually a couple of ways, but really one of the simplest ones is to come in here and do let ignore and then set this to false, right? This is just a Boolean that is going to be local to this useEffect over here. Then you're just not going to set the data if ignore is true, right? So if ignore is true, you're not going to set the data because it starts initially here as false. This is not going to run and you are going to set that data initially. This has to be a let. I think my Copilot, my editor, my cursor, yeah, it likes to change it automatically on format. That's fine. And then here in the return body, we're just going to set its value to true so that if ever we get a new page, we're basically not going to set the post here, right, if ignore is true. This is unfortunately not going to cancel the request in flight, so the request still is going to execute, still is going to return data, but at least we're not going to set the data and we're not going to have any visual race conditions in our application. So again, this is cool. We fixed the problem. We have loading, we have error, we have race conditions, but now our hook is looking quite complex and there's a lot of things that we have to manage here, a lot of potential risks for bugs, and even worse, this doesn't even cover half of the functionality that we should be having when it comes to data fetching in a modern web application. The thing is, times have changed, right? It's not enough to just have a loading state. It's not enough to just have like a simple error state and fetch the data. Now, modern web applications expect a lot more, right? Let's say that, for example, we wanted to have this data here, the same endpoint with the same page, but we wanted to have it in a different page in our application, right? By some different component. Well, if we now even use the same component, let's say we want to be smart and reuse the functionality, what would happen is every single time that I navigate to either of these pages, we're going to trigger a new fetch request of that same endpoint with the same data that we want. And this is inefficient, especially if I just went to the first page and then I go to the second page, I'm re-triggering a fetch request for the same data that I already just fetched. This is unnecessary load on the server and it's a bad practice. In a modern web application, you shouldn't have this. You should have some sort of cache system set up in place. Right? Caching is this idea that you fetch something, you store it in a cache, and then if you want to fetch the same thing in a short time after that, instead of making a fresh fetch request, you're just going to return the data from the cache because it's not considered stale. This is something that is expected in modern web applications, and if you don't have that, then your application is actually inferior. So then what are you going to do? Are you going to continue using useEffect here? Are you going to start implementing your own caching solution, which by the way, I'm not going to do because that's a lot more involved. Are you going to implement your own caching solution? Just to do that, just think of the amount of surface area that you would be introducing with this new feature, right? What if you're caching something wrong? What if you return the wrong data for the wrong cache? The user is going to see something that they don't expect. There's so many things that can go wrong, and it's going to be a nightmare to manage. And the more you go down this path of doing everything yourself manually, the more you're shooting yourself in the foot, and the more problems you're going to have later on when you eventually decide that you want to switch because you realize that this is unmaintainable. Right? So I hope that with this, I'm convincing you that this is not the way to handle your data fetching in your React applications. You shouldn't do data fetching using a useEffect. Going down this path is not maintainable and is going to come back to haunt you in the long term. Instead, what you should do is you should use something that actually has all of these features here and more, and that can offer those features to you in a very simple to use API with only a few lines of code. And spoiler alert, that thing, you guessed it, is going to be React Query. So here I have the same component, the same task, right, to fetch the data from the same endpoint, but now we're using React Query. And look at just how much simpler this actually is. We have one hook over here, useQuery, that is the most fundamental hook from React Query. All we have to do is pass it here a query key, which is going to handle all of the caching for us automatically, and then the actual asynchronous function to fetch our data, which is the same thing here. We're fetching the posts from the same URL, and then we're returning response.json. This is all that React Query needs to have all of the same functionality that we had previously implementing it ourselves, and actually more. React Query has caching built in. With this query key over here, it will handle the cache. If you're trying to fetch the same endpoint in another component, if you're passing it the same cache over here, it's going to return to you the results from the cache, right? You want this. This is the new standard of modern web applications. React Query handles it automatically for you. You don't need to manage anything yourself. And if you look at this, with just a few lines of code, not only have we implemented more functionality than we had before, but we've completely eliminated the surface area for potential bugs because we're not handling anything ourselves anymore. We're letting React Query do all of that. And React Query is open source. The library has been battle tested for many years. It doesn't have the bugs. You can rely on it securely to handle your data fetching, your asynchronous state for you. It handles the loading state. It handles the error state. It gives you back the data here. It handles background refetching. You can configure this behavior to how you want. You can enable, disable, configure the caching how you want. And it has everything that you would need for a modern data fetching solution. So why wouldn't you use this? Why wouldn't you use this in your project, even if it's a super small project, instead of doing everything else yourself manually and opening up yourself to so many problems down the line, right? So React Query is the way. Even if you have one component, even if you have a super basic and simple application, React Query is always the solution if you're doing anything with data fetching or asynchronous state. Now, here's the thing. We've covered a very simple application and a very simple example here. The reality is that most applications are a lot more complex, and oftentimes you're not even doing this in the component directly. You're actually fetching your data outside of the React component in your navigation library, which I have a video on. That is a better approach. But even in those cases, React Query should still be your choice and should still be the default thing that you use for your data fetching. And let me show you why. So here I have the official TanStack router documentation, which if you don't know what TanStack router is, it's essentially a navigation library that you can use in React. It allows your application to have multiple pages and render specific components on specific pages, which is, if you're building a real application, most likely something that you're going to want to have. And this is an example of how you would do data fetching in those applications. So here what we have is we have this create file root. This essentially just creates this URL that our application or users can go to. And here we can actually configure what gets shown on that specific URL. For example, the component here. We can show this post component right here. And this is the post component. This returns from JSX and gets the post data from use loader data. So what is this? This useLoaderData is coming directly from here, from this loader function here, and this is enabled because we now have a navigation layer that we can actually use to do things like our data fetching. Generally, it's better to do your data fetching outside of your React components because it simplifies things a lot. You don't need to bloat your React components with all of this data fetching logic, all of the re-renders that come with it, having to handle loading and error states. It's better to do it at the navigation layer because then your components can just access the data and then do whatever they need to do with the data, and you let the loader actually fetch your data and do that. It's actually more efficient because you can do this before the bundle of the actual component, the JavaScript bundle, has loaded. But again, I'm not going to go too deep into this. I have a video on this specific pattern if you want to explore that a little bit more. So here we have this loader. This is essentially the function that allows us to load some data to make it available to our component. And here we're not using React Query. We have here these parameters here, like the post ID. This is coming directly from the URL. So whatever post ID we have in this URL, that's the one we're going to be fetching. And then we're going to call here fetch post, pass it the post ID, and then that post is going to be accessible by using root.useLoaderData. So you see here in the component, no data fetching. It's super simple. It already has the data that it needs. It doesn't need to load or do anything with that, and it can just directly use the post inside of its body. This is better. The error and the loading are handled at the navigation layer. So here we're passing an error component, which is going to render this if we have an error. So the component itself doesn't need to do that. Same for the loading. We're not showing it here, but you can also put a loading component, right? A pending component to show something while it's loading. And then again, you don't have to worry about data fetching in your component. Now, in this example here, as you can see, we're not using React Query, right? Which is fine because this is on the official documentation, and you actually don't need to use React Query to be able to use TanStack Router, and they want to show that. But it's actually recommended that you use React Query with TanStack Router. And actually, React Query is called TanStack Query. They're made by the same people, so they are meant to be used together. And the reason why is because of all of the arguments that I said in the simple example. If you just fetch your data here and just render it like this is fine. You are going to get your data. You're going to handle your loading and error states. That's totally fine. But this has no caching, has no background refetches, has no way to interact with all of these rich features that we want in this modern web application, right? This is, again, very simple and very bare bones. And this is here on the documentation just to show you how TanStack Router works. It's not focused on specifically how React Query works and the benefits of using React Query. But if you then go and open up a different example, so this is now a different example here, this one is using React Query. And let's see how that works. So here we have the same loader, we have the same post component, but here instead of just directly fetching the data, we're actually going to use the query client here, which comes from React Query, and we're going to call ensure query data, and then we're going to pass all of the query options of the post. What this is going to do is this is going to prefetch the data for this query here, for the post query. It's going to prefetch it to then make it available inside of this component over here. Not this one, this is the error component. We're going to skip this one, but inside of the main post component here. So here, instead of just using useLoaderData to directly access the post from the loader itself, we're going to go through React Query instead. So here, we're just going to get the post ID from the parameters. This again is going to come from the URL. And then here, we're going to call useSuspenseQuery, and then we're going to pass it here the same query options that we passed in our loader. This is going to fetch the data from the cache directly, and we're going to have it here. Because we're using suspense query, we're essentially telling React Query that this data has already been fetched before, which it has in this loader over here. So we don't need to handle the loading state or the error state in this component. It's again handled at the navigation layer. And this is superior to how we were doing it before, because now we have the same benefits that we had before from fetching at the navigation layer. We can fetch it before the component. We can fetch it before the bundle of the component. The component doesn't need to worry about loading and error states, but at the same time, we're getting all of the benefits of React Query, like the cache, like the background refetching. We can now use this query in any component and it would just work, right? And it's the same API. We're still using TanStack Router, but now we're using React Query with it. So again, this is the better approach. And it's the better approach at not that much of a bigger cost, right? The only cost is now you have to know and use useEffect query, pass it here the query options. So it is a little bit more complex than just using it directly by just calling fetch post directly, but you get so much more out of it that it's a no-brainer. So even in this case, even if you're doing something that is more realistic of a real application that is more modern, React query is still the better option, and you should still default to it. And again, I'm reiterating, React query, TanStack query, right? It's the same thing, is made by the same people that have TanStack router, right? So they're meant to be used together. So why wouldn't you use them together? But now, even with this, it doesn't fully cover all of the potential ways that you could structure your React application and do your data fetching. We're going to look at one more example, and this one is going to be on the server with server components and Next.js. So in server components, like we have here, this is the official Next.js documentation. This works a little bit differently, and here you might have a shot at arguing that React query isn't always going to be necessary. But I'm still going to argue that in the end, you're still going to need React query at some point, just because of the nature of what React is and how your users are interacting with it. So server components, right? They are React components that run exclusively on the server. Because of that, they can be asynchronous components, which means that you can directly call a fetch and await the fetch inside of the body of the component without doing any sort of useEffect or any sort of client-based things. This is really cool because you don't have to handle loading states, error states, anything like that. You can just directly fetch the data in your component, and then you can get it and directly render it and return it. What's going to happen here is this component is going to run on the server. It's going to make the fetch. It's going to compute the actual JSX here, which will get converted to HTML. And then that HTML is going to get sent to the browser, and that's what your users are going to see. And here, because everything runs on the server, there's no need to have anything with React query, right? There's no background refetches going on, there's no loading, there's no error states, and even the caching layer can be implemented at the server level by Next.js, right? React query is not something that you use on the server, it's something that you use on the client. And if you want the caching from React query, that's going to be client-side caching. But here, because it's on the server, you can just use the server caching and then get away with not using React query. And this is perfectly fine, and there are valid use cases where React query maybe doesn't need to be used here. But in my experience, in most real projects, even if you build everything with server components, at some point you will run into a situation where you need to bring the data that you fetch from the server into the client, because you need some sort of client functionality that you can't do on the server. One very simple example that's pretty common is pagination, right? Let's say that here we have 10,000 posts, right? We're not going to fetch all 10,000 posts in one go. That would be very inefficient. We might fetch the first 10 or 20 or so, and then let's say this was a social media application. As the user scrolls, we're then going to fetch the next page and the next page after that. Well, that functionality has to be done on the client. You can't do this interactivity stuff on scroll on the server. You need to have some client component that listens and checks the scroll behavior of the user and then triggers another fetch request, which means that you need to take this data here and you need to move it over to the client to be able to fetch more data. And now you're faced with the same set of problems that we had here in our initial example. How do you do it? Do you do it manually with the useEffect? Do you store the page in a state variable, call useEffect and do it again? Or do you again choose React query because it is the better solution? So even here, even in an application where you can have server components, you can fetch your data on the server and not have to deal with the client whatsoever, you will run into a situation where you want to have something on the client. And at that point, React query becomes the best option that you can choose to solve that problem. It should be the default option, no matter how big or small your application is, and no matter what type of application it is. As soon as you're dealing with any sort of asynchronous state, any sort of state that lives on the server, always choose React query. So yeah, I hope that with this video, I was able to convince you that React query is always the best solution and is always a safe bet. If you disagree, please do leave me a comment down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on your specific use case where React query isn't a good option. So that's it. That's all that I had for this video. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to leave it a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe or click here to watch a different video of mine. My name has been Cousin. This is Cousin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.